This is your urgent call to action. We are all called to lead in a world in chaos, crisis, and turmoil. Join a pivotal global movement for change to transform the leadership crisis worldwide. Will you play it safe, or will you wake up, step up, and speak out? Like Nelson Mandela did for South Africa and the world, we need a radical new way to think, act, and lead, leading boldly into the future. Join host Anne Pratt, a Harvard Fellow and multi-awarded businesswoman, and unlock the best version of yourself to revolutionize leadership with what the world needs now.
Greetings to all you future bold leaders. Thank you for joining us from around the world. My name is Anne Pratt. I'm formerly from South Africa, and I relocated abroad to attend a Harvard Advanced Leadership Initiative Fellowship in beautiful Boston in the United States of America. Today, our thoughtful bold leader joins us from the DC area in the USA. He's a Fulbright scholar, an innovation advisor, and a multiple award-winning author of 3 book titles: Rebel Leadership, The Language of Man, and A Deliberate Pause. He's also a popular columnist for magazines like Inc. Magazine, The Creativity Post, CEO World Magazine, Fast Company, and many more. Stay tuned as he helps us dig deeper and shares profound insights on boldness, rebel leadership, and how you can become a bold rebel leader too. The changing nature of risk in this new abnormal world, and why soul matters most. We warmly welcome my inspiring friend, Larry Robertson, and welcome to Leading Boldly into the Future. Larry, what a joy to see you again. Thank you so much for coming and being part of this conversation. I'm looking forward to it.
It's my absolute privilege. I'm looking forward to it as well.
Great, thank you. First of all, congratulations. 3 best-time sellers. What a fantastic feat. I have much to learn from you, Larry. So well done on your great best-selling books.
I appreciate it. Thank you.
And today I'd like to talk about one of them in particular, because I think, that focuses rebel leadership. I'd like to begin asking you around your definition of leadership. And before I do that, I note we share a similar philosophy and ideology and a belief that anyone can lead, and we're all called to lead. So I'm curious, what is your definition of leadership, and what is your definition of rebel leadership?
Great questions. And so let me begin by saying this before my definition of leadership.
Yeah.
There is a general agreement among not just people who study leadership or advise and consult on it, but leaders who've actually been successful, that leadership is situational.
Yes.
And so if the approach and even the people who are doing the leading don't recognize what the situation is and adapt to serve that particular situation, not just serve it, but to leverage it, then leadership will be off course. It doesn't matter what your definition is. So I think it's really important to say that. But that leads to the fact that right now we have a huge mismatch between typical forms of leadership and the environment we're in. I'm sure we'll get into that later. But to get to the definition, here's what it means to me. A leader's job is to create an environment where everybody not only can lead, but is expected to lead and empowered to lead, each in their own way. It doesn't mean everybody is going to, do their spin in the CEO's office at some point during the year. Within every position up and down a chain of command or within an organization, there's an opportunity to lead. And the people who are in those positions actually know how to lead best for their position and for their situation. So my definition of leadership is creating that environment where everybody can step up to lead.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think, in terms of some of the philosophies that come through in the book, I think it's reinforced in that. Can we turn to rebel leadership? I mean, it's a wonderful word.
Yes.
What is the definition of rebel leadership?
Thank you. That was the other part of your question, but I wanted to make that really important pause just to define leadership in general. And part of the reason
Yeah.
I wanted to do that, and then I'll answer your question about rebel leadership, is most of us carry in our heads this false equation about leadership. I thought your question was perfect because you asked what my definition of leadership was.
Yeah.
And too quickly we jump to saying, well, what's the definition of a leader or a good leader? And we have this tendency to put a big equal sign between the word leader and leadership.
Yes.
And as if to say that one singular leader is the way to go, that one person who has all the answers or all the ideas or is going to fix everything. And it really sets us up for failure in the larger definition of leadership. That goes right into your question about what's the definition of rebel leadership.
Yeah.
Rebel leadership is two words brought together to define a new term. When we think of rebels in the best sense,
Yeah.
we think about people, this will sound a little strange. We think about people not who are huge risk takers or dice rollers or things like that. Really, what we think about are people who are open. So they're open to seeing new opportunities. They're open to seeing threats on the horizon. They're open to change and new ideas. And they're actually open to sharing leadership beyond themselves. That's really what makes for an effective, impactful rebel. And a leader in the leadership part of rebel leadership is that person, as I said earlier, who recognizes that their primary job is not to have all the answers, but to create that environment in which everybody can lead. Rebel leadership puts those two things together. And the reason it does is to say, we live in a time now where leaders and leadership need to be constantly open to change because the environment around us is constantly and rapidly changing as never before. Some use that acronym VUCA, which stands for a world that is more volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous than any we've ever seen before. And I think the mistake would be to think that that's momentary or temporary. In reality, it's our new state, or what I call our new abnormal.
Yes.
And so the best match, remember I said leadership is situational, is for leaders to recognize that that environment is going to be ongoing. And my argument is that only rebel leadership can appropriately step up to that environment.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, And in that context, I know you reference in the boldness and bold leadership and the work of Galinsky and in willing to be open and willing to change and willing to empower others. Can you share a little more with us around Galinsky's research around what bold leadership is? I know he talks about the fear of being too weak and the fear of being too strong.
Yes.
Can you just elaborate a little more? What is bold leadership in the context of his work?
Yeah, so he's a professor at Columbia, and he looks at boldness in terms of really human potential, not just leadership, but leadership is one manifestation of it. His idea, to just build on what you said, is that everybody has this range of boldness, and it's bounded on either side by going too far or not going far enough.
Yeah.
And the idea is really to expand that range of boldness. He says that's really a human inclination to want to be bold, but you got to find yourself in that range. And he says the two most important things about understanding your own range of boldness and making it as broad as possible lie in what you know about yourself and what others know and believe about you. So this is really interesting when it comes to leadership, because to me, it says two things. It says, number one, just because you have the title doesn't mean you're fit to lead.
Of course.
You have to understand who you are. I refer to that as you have to understand your soul.
Yes.
And I don't mean soul in the typical way. My definition of soul is who you are in the context of what you do and how what you do impacts and connects to others.
Yes.
So if you tie back to Galinsky, he's saying you have to have an awareness of that. It's not just doing your job as the leader or understanding it or even defining what your job is as the leader. It's understanding how that impacts and connects to others and operating from there. That's one side of it.
Yeah.
But when you do that, when you operate in that context of others, then you are much closer to understanding how they perceive you, whether or not they trust you, how much they're willing to engage with you. And all of a sudden, you're defining Galinsky's range of boldness, and you're making it more expansive. So that's why I refer to his research, because he really, instead of just saying this is something that occurs among leaders and in leadership, he's
Yeah.
saying, no, this is something that happens with human beings. And
Yes.
so his argument is that you can find this range of boldness about yourself, and it's going to benefit you no matter what. I'm taking it a step further to say you absolutely have to understand that range of boldness as a leader. And when you do, you're going to be more effective.
Yeah. And, the point that you make that, he makes reference to boldness from an individual point of view. It goes back to the notion that we're all called to lead. So, in terms of defining that individual range of boldness determines the extent, in a way, to how willing we are to step out and stand up and speak out and lead.
It's absolutely true, Anne. And there's a really interesting piece that you're touching on here, and it expands beyond Galinsky's research to some research that's been done by Brad Stulberg and his partner, Steve Magnus. They're really, really interesting people who research and consult on peak performance, peak human performance.
Yeah.
And what they would say to their research would say to expand on the whole boldness idea is that this isn't just an individual thing.
Yeah.
Our human ability to be bold in general always relies on other people in one form or another. And it relies on our ability to sometimes be the individual who's bold, and in
Yeah.
other cases, to embolden others to
Yes.
be bold.
Yes.
So it's this connection between people that actually raises our collective boldness. So when I say leadership, I often say leadership is cultural
Yeah.
and leadership is collective.
Yes.
And part of the reason for that is that's what it enables us to be bold ongoing. And that's exactly what we need to be in a very volatile world.
Yeah, that is so powerful. And it kind of evokes all sorts of memories around various movements around the world and that collective form of leadership that has, it kind of inspires that thinking. And when I think of even my own life and living through a transformation in South Africa and that liberation struggle, certainly it was the collective leadership and the, not only the boldness of many, many individuals and unsung heroes, but how that emboldened all of us to stand up and speak out and, join the collective movement for change. So it's really interesting, and interesting how that feeds into movements as well. And how these movements then, spread around the world.
Absolutely. One of the things that and you would know this better and from more personal experience, but one of the things that I have always admired about the movement in South Africa and the links to Mandela is this recognition that it wasn't just a moment of movement. It wasn't as though one thing was to be achieved and then we were all done. There seemed to be this ongoing recognition that what makes a movement powerful and really what makes leadership powerful is the understanding that it's a living thing. It
Yes.
keeps going forward and there's a new challenge that follows, each one behind it. In fact, there's an old Haitian saying that Haitian proverb, I guess I should call it, that
Yeah,
says there are mountains beyond mountains.
I love it.
And actually, Mandela had his own turn of phrase on that too. He said, I think after climbing a great hill, one only finds that there are many more hills to climb.
Absolutely.
So it's a
Yeah.
combination of boldness that allows a movement to begin or an idea to be ideated. But it's really, how does that boldness become cultural? How does it allow for the ongoing openness and adaptation that rebel thinkers embody? And I think that is really tied to the fact that the job of leadership is mountains beyond mountains. It's interesting in Haiti, that's used both as a positive and as a negative. So
Okay.
it's used to talk about how there's just is this prevailing impossibility, right? There are mountains beyond mountains, but
Yeah.
it's also used as a way to describe opportunity. And again, we're coming full circle back to Mandela because, another quote he's well known for that I really love is, it always seems impossible until it's done.
Absolutely.
And yet the way he lived said, yes, it always seems impossible because there's a mountain beyond each mountain. So I just wanted to call out that boldness is something that you don't just pull out of a bag of tricks when you're in trouble or you need a great idea. It's
Yeah.
something that's there in the culture to always want to do better. That's really what embodies rebel leadership as well.
I love that definition. You know, you referenced, Larry, about this abnormal time we're living in. In this abnormal time of turbulence and, you know, change that's happening faster than many can keep up with,
Hmm.
what for you are the biggest strategic issues and challenges facing not only the United States, but the world? What do you think those are?
So I'm going to tell you that my answer to that will be a brief repeat of what we've talked about. And
Okay.
and the reason I say that is there's still a dominantly prevailing view of leaders and leadership
Yeah.
that suffers from this hero myth that one person or one organization or even one country
Yeah.
can solve the challenges that we face right now. And the flip side of that is true, can take advantage of the opportunities that this very volatile, uncertain world presents, because there's always that pairing, right? That kinship of opportunity with the challenge.
Yeah.
So I think that is one of the key things, is to be willing to let go of that hero myth within leadership and to embrace it as I said before, as something that's both collective and cultural. Here's the interesting thing. I think, with very few exceptions, most leaders know that, and most leaders want to do that. But we continue to talk about leaders and leadership in a way that sets up this expectation
Yeah.
that leaders should go against that instinct and somehow appear heroic, to have the answer or to present the calm or to come up with the great idea all by themselves. And so, we keep reinforcing this hero image. I would say that is the biggest challenge that we face right now.
So that is so interesting. And, you know, you also talk about the fact that there are fault lines, there are risks that we're not yet aware of. What do you think those are? And are those part of the challenges we face?
They definitely are. And so rather than saying, "Oh, this particular thing is a risk
Yeah.
right now," like access to energy or fresh water, or something more strategic within an organization. I think that the important thing to recognize is that risk itself is changing. So it was interesting. The World Economic Forum puts out an annual risk report.
Yeah.
And to do that, they survey up to 1,000 of their members each year about risk. Their members are people who are the leaders of the world in the private sector, in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector. So they're asking leaders about leadership.
Yeah.
In 2018, in their report, they made a point of calling out that their observation was that risk itself was changing, and in ways leaders weren't fully reflecting. So they talked about two different kinds of risks. And one was the kind of risk that we're familiar with. It may arrive as a surprise, but it's the kind of risk that pretty soon we get our minds around, and then we get our arms around, and then we return to a new type of status quo. And what they were saying is the kind of risk in the world today is quite different. They called it complex risk.
Mhm.
And what they meant is that it can come from lots of different places, even places you'd think would have no relationship at all to your leadership. More than that, it happens at all different levels of organizations and societies and economies and so on. And all those individual risks that used to do a pretty good job of staying apart from one another are now weaving over one another, sometimes in ways we can see, but more often below the surface. And so even the way we deal with risk, and in the past, that's been to understand it, to solve it, and come up with a new status
Yeah.
quo, has to change so that we see risk as something that's not only ever present, but it's ever present in a complex way. And that just comes right back around to everything we've been saying about leadership. How do you contend with complex risk? You make leadership not individual, you make it cultural, just as one example.
And could you give us some examples of complex risks, these complex risks, or what sort of examples would illustrate the complex risk?
Well, I think, let's look at some of the most obvious ones today. For a number of decades, we could have a military event in a particular country that we might have talked about in the news, but didn't ripple very far into any of our businesses' lives or even other countries. Ukraine is showing that that is absolutely not the case. That even if the war doesn't come to our shores, it's increasing or it's threatening our energy supplies, our access to agriculture. It goes on and on.
Yeah.
Even the politics of any particular country. We went for a lot of decades where most countries around the world, when they had political upheaval or a movement to the right or to the left, it stayed pretty isolated to that country. And now we're seeing not just a ripple effect, but copycat. It worked there, so I can make it work here. So this is all, I think, part of a world that's much more interconnected than we even give it credit for. Even when we give lip service to say, this is really a global economy. This is really a global, not just market, but way of interacting, global communication. We say that, but now we're really seeing some of the ripple effects of that. And it's impacting not only how we see leadership, but what leadership needs to do to step up to those complex risks.
Yeah, you raised such an important point about, globalization, which really is a genie out of the bottle. Despite the move back to sort of popular nationalism and national thinking, it's almost, the world has moved beyond that.
I gave some kind of obvious and traditional ways, but I'll call out the elephant in the room too. We've talked about potential pandemics for 20 years.
Yeah.
SARS and bird flu and H2 and so on. Right. And it wasn't until COVID that we said, oh my God, that actually can have a ripple effect. And guess what? It can affect a leader's ability to do their job, to run a country, to run a locality, a city or a town or something like that. It can affect worldwide supply chains. Who knew our supply chains were as weak as they are, had as many vulnerabilities as they are? So I use that just as a way to say, if that can happen, if that kind of unexpected thing can happen, even within the realm of what we think we expect, really anything can happen. That's complex risk.
Yeah. That's a good point. That's a great point. Coming back to your young life, you're steeped in this work around new thinking, radical new thinking, bold disruptions, and we'll come back to some of that too. But I was curious, Larry, in your young life, is there a pivotal moment, a defining moment that was really tough and difficult for you? Where were you? What happened at the time? What was a point of revelation?
Yeah, so it's an interesting question, and I'll tell you why it's always interesting for me. I'm a big believer that even though we can, in hindsight, identify big moments, they're usually an accumulation of many smaller ones.
Mm-hmm.
So I would describe my moment. I can pick a moment that was pivotal, but it was really an accumulation of smaller moments. So in my growing up, I had wonderful grandparents, but in particular, I had a wonderful grandfather, my mom's father. He was a true entrepreneur in his time. He was also an incredibly hard worker. In fact, he was bored if he wasn't working on something that allowed him to create or to learn or to move things forward or to help someone. And every time I was with him, I mean, most of the times I was with him, we were not at his work. We were just in day to day, but he would show that example of there's always something to work on. But there was a more important element to it as well. And that was he always had a lightness and a laughter that went along with his hard work. So sometimes the hard work was towards something that was really positive and exciting, a new opportunity. And sometimes it was just trudging through crap, to be perfectly honest. But he always brought that lightness and that laughter. So, plant that as one small experience along the way. I had a father that when I grew up frequently said, trust your gut. And I understood that phrase for what it was, but I really thought about it in hindsight as something that was in a particular moment rather than a habit, that you should trust your gut in every situation. So my first pivotal moment was, for a long, long time, I was taught the rules of the various games I was playing. I don't mean just athletic, but academic and things that led to awards and honors and opportunities. And I played by those rules and I benefited by those rules. But the chief benefit I got was getting a chance to play the next game and the next set of rules. And then I took my first post-college job. And it was the first time that I realized that the rule makers, the people running that organization, were not nearly as invested in me as they were in me making sure I was invested in their rules, ones that mostly benefited them. And so it was in that moment that I started to bring back memories of my grandfather and what hard work really meant, an opportunity to learn, an opportunity to create, an opportunity to advance something. That started to drive my thinking about, okay, well, what am I going to do next?
Yeah.
I also tried to do it, here I was a rule follower for all these years.
Yeah.
If I want to break out of that, how do I do that responsibly and effectively?
Yeah.
That's what one of the chief guides was. Make sure you're having fun as you do it. I know that sounds silly, but that ability to do that actually allowed me to stay more open and fresh to the opportunities that I was seeing around me in any state. And then my dad's advice came in. Trust your gut.
Yeah.
And so by blending that into it and starting to take closer notice of the decisions I was making or the things that were before me as opportunities or problems to solve, and seeing behind them what they might really mean rather than just what they meant on the surface, that became a real difference maker for me. So it was that first confrontation, if you will, or realization that even when you follow those rules, even when you're a great team player, you have to have a sense of your own soul. You have to trust your gut. And you have to see that bigger picture beyond the immediate game you're playing. I'd say that was a real difference maker for me.
Yeah. And I'm also curious, do you have an example of how your grandfather, a specific example, made work fun?
Yes. When he would come to our house when I was a little kid, my mother would give him, I guess you could say, her daughter version of the honey-do list, a long list of chores that needed to be done, many of which included myself and my brother. We needed to be participants. And my grandfather would make those chores fun. If we had to sweep a garage, which I had to do often, and we had open garages in Arizona, so they got lots of dirt and dust in it, he would make it a competition. Who could sweep a section the fastest? Who could write their name in the dust using the broom? Who could come up with the craziest song as we swept? All of those things got the job done, but they were fun along the way.
That's a fabulous example. That's interesting. And in terms of using your gut, I'm also struck by your dad's advice, Larry.
Hmm.
You know, you're also a very well accomplished, formally qualified academic. You're a Fulbright scholar. How do you balance this nuance between the academic, rational research approach versus the intuition? And do you have an example of when you had a challenge between the two? What did you do?
Yeah, well, it turns out that challenge continues to exist, and the example I'll give you is that challenge was there in every one of my books because my brain really operates in on both sides that you put out there. There is a side to me that is much more research oriented, much more, I guess you could say, academic in that sense, but really wanting to get to the root of things, really wanting to see the data, right? There's another part of me that says that's great, but if it means nothing in actual practice, then it's worthless. I mean, it's interesting, but it's really kind of worthless.
Sure.
So that what happens in actual practice side of me is really taking out into the real world that research that I've done or that others have done and seeing how is it actually used? What are the patterns in use? So if you have different leaders in different sectors using similar advice or they're following similar habits, are they doing it in the same way? Where are they applying it? Where are they not applying it? To me, that's just what logically makes sense. You need both of those sides. You need that depth of research, but if you can't make it practical, it just isn't that useful.
Sure.
And you need to take it a level above that and say, that pattern repeats itself.
Yeah.
So what I can learn in business sciences has to be matched up with what works in business practice. What I can learn in psychological sciences has to match up with what people are doing when they actually apply that psychology or those things we know about the human mind. And then I really should look for the patterns through all of that. So for me, I'm always working in that mix between all of those things, but it's always an effort to strike a balance. And you will always have people in your audience who say, you should be more one than the other. Of course, they're going to say that.
Yeah.
Typically, they're more vested in one than the other. Typically, they're more comfortable in one or the other. But as any leader knows, it's a mix of the two that always allows you to adapt and to succeed and to have lasting impact. So I try to remember that that's what success is defined by in the end, and keep it in my mix all the way along the line.
Yeah, and you also raised the point about the adaptation. It reminds me of, one of the points coming back to your book, Rebel Leadership, about the difference between what leaders think they need, what they actually need, and this distinction between creativity and problem solving on the one hand versus adaptation.
Mm.
Can you share a little more with us around what do you think leaders really need?
So it's very interesting that you touched on the creativity part. There's a chapter in Rebel Leadership. So my chapters are just, by the way, the titles of the chapters are really named to reflect what leaders told me.
Yeah.
And so the chapter that I'm referring to is titled "It's the Culture, Stupid."
Yeah.
The idea is to say we all talk about culture as important, but we don't often invest in culture. We think of it as something that, I don't know, comes out the end of the sausage making machine, and you don't have to put effort into it. It'll just be there. But culture can become your chief competitive advantage if you treat it that way, if you look at it that way, and if you see leadership as fundamental to it. So here's what ties back to what you asked. To make leadership cultural, to both define and then to continue to shape a culture,
Yeah.
you need to understand that there are three critical components that go into that. One is that every long-term prosperous business, successful business, is a co-creation.
Yeah.
So this goes back to that very first point of it's never one person ideating. It's never one department that's doing that. It's a collective that does that ongoing, that makes it cultural, that realizes that co-creation is key, that is able to adapt, to keep creating, to keep innovating. That's number one, is you've got to make co-creation central. The second thing is that everything comes down to inquiry. And the key in inquiry is not just asking questions, because we think about questions as something where we ask it in order to get an answer. And we do that, but that's a short-term function. The power in inquiry is allowing the questions to remain open. And really that comes back to that first thing, the co-creation. If we continue to ask the questions, we're likely to see threats sooner, see opportunities sooner, and so on. So if you allow co-creation and inquiry to exist alongside one another, you've really raised the odds of being more successful as a leader. But there's a third component, and that is the allowance for diversity. And what I mean by diversity is diversity in the mind, diversity of experiences, diversity of backgrounds, diversity of intelligences, diversity of ways of looking at things. To truly allow that to become part of the co-creation and part of the questioning is what the most successful leaders in these turbulent times are finding works for them. It's really coming full circle to engage everyone in leadership so that you as the individual senior leader not only raise the odds of your organization being successful, you raise your own odds of being successful. That's really where I think those components come in.
Yeah, no, that's so valuable. And I think the whole conversation around culture, I was struck by one of the definitions of culture as, just simply the things you do. And also the research around, the business case for diversity. Would you like to share a little more about that?
I think the simple thing to say, I know there's some in your audience who probably would just love to delve into the data. And I will tell you that on both my website and in the back of the Rebel Leadership book, I direct you to more sources than you could ever imagine. Here's the more important thing. There is so much evidence, not just current, but going back over the last 15 to 20 years, about the positive impact of diversity in organizations. Not just it's a positive thing, meaning it's the right thing to do. We should have diverse cultures and we shouldn't be inclusive and there should be equity for everyone. It's much more than that. It's these differences in perspective that often lead to conflicting ideas, that lead to challenging the status quo, things we've tended to avoid over time as leaders, that actually keep the energy going in an organization, that allow an organization to be more adaptable and more adept. So what I encourage leaders to see is that this isn't just a hunch. And we aren't talking just about diversity in terms of how we look, how we represent on the outside. we're talking about creating a culture where different ideas get exchanged in different ways, and they allow that inquiry that often includes challenge to occur. And I think the fear that most leaders have is that if they allow those things in, it's going to just turn into a chaotic organization.
Yeah.
But those leaders who've done that, who've embraced diversity in that sense that I just defined, and allow it to be part of their everyday leading and the everyday culture, have found that rather than stepping off this feared cliff, it's more like stepping off a curb. It does take getting used to the fact that questions should be ongoing. It does take getting used to conflict as being a normal part of the creative process. But the benefits and the rewards go right to the bottom line. And that's what the research tells us, is that the organizations that are doing this on an ongoing basis, allowing diversity to be core to their culture, they're seeing returns on the bottom line, not just in revenues, on the bottom line of 15 to 20% more than organizations that aren't. If you need the data, I highly encourage you to go look for it, and I've provided resources for that. But the more important point is that takeaway. This idea of a diversity being important is real. It's not just right, it's real.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other thing that struck me too, about some of these things in business that are often difficult for people to get their heads around and to have these conversations. And you talk about one of the, what is the unique selling proposition that will forever give you competitive advantage no matter what the circumstance, even during this turbulent change. You talk about how soul matters most. Can you share a little more an example of an organization? First of all, define, why soul matters most.
Sure.
And then is there an example of an organization that perhaps resisted that and then found that letting soul be their unique selling proposition helped transform the organization to create sustainable impact and high performance in areas?
Sure, absolutely. So the first part of your question related to soul was, I'm sorry, I lost the thread there. Is
No
to
problem.
put my definition around it, or to say exactly why it's most important?
Well, two things. Firstly, your definition, and
Okay.
secondly, why does soul matter most?
Okay. So my definition of it is what I mentioned earlier, and that is soul is an understanding or a sense individually of who you are. Importantly, who you are in the context of what you do and how what you do impacts and connects to others. So this is a really important distinction. Some people talk about soul, as I'm referring to it, as, oh, well, you mean like purpose, like the shared purpose of an organization. Yes, but no. When I talk about soul, I'm talking about you as an individual. It is similar to purpose in an organization, except that purpose in an organization, and I don't want to overlook this, to work has to be both shared and attended to. So that means that it needs to be something that's shaped together by multiple individuals, ideally everybody in the organization. It needs to be something that's cared for ongoing. If you don't know your own soul as an individual, you can't possibly come to that equation of shared purpose and be an effective contributor. I mean, you can participate, but you don't really have a sense of your own internal compass. And remember my definition, your internal compass as it relates to what you do that connects to and impacts other people.
Sure.
That's an important distinction in my mind, that soul is this individual thing connected to that thing we talk a lot about in organizations and leadership of purpose and shared purpose. To give you an example, let me catch that middle part. You asked why it's most important. I'm not saying it's most important. I'm saying that's what leaders are saying is most important. And the example I give in my book is when I was researching for my very first book on entrepreneurship, and I interviewed more than 220 incredibly diverse leaders. I would ask them an open-ended question really about, is there anything along the way in your journey, which we all know for entrepreneurs and innovators includes highs and lows. Is there anything in that journey, I would ask them, that stood out as your most important, your most critical asset? And to the person almost, they would say soul. I didn't provide the words, they chose that word. And when you looked across them, their definition of soul was exactly as I just defined it. And what they said was sometimes that functioned as their motivator. Sometimes it functioned as the motivation they gave to others. Always it focused as their compass. And then, as we just spoke about, it helped to inform the compass that the organization created together for their culture, for their strategy, for their fundamental business pursuits. So why does soul matter most? Because these leaders are telling you it's the one thing that you can rely on no matter what happens in this complex and risky world out there. That's the importance of it. And then I think the third part of what you asked was, is there an example of an organization who lost their way as it relates to soul or never recognized it in this form and regained? Absolutely. And it's Microsoft. So somewhere along the way in the transition away from Bill Gates leading that organization to Steve Ballmer leading that organization, Microsoft forgot that it was founded as an innovative company, that innovation is what drove its growth over almost 2 decades, that it was innovation that was at the heart of why people came to Microsoft, why people admired their products. Under Ballmer's reign, and I'm not pointing a finger at him and saying he was all wrong, it became much more about maintaining the portfolio of assets. And in that effort, innovation and the things that were behind it, openness, inquiry, diversity of ideas, all of the co-creation was tamped down on because it was considered a potential threat to the assets that had been accumulated. So it was interesting because even though it might have been right to try to protect those assets, it was wrong, I would say, to lose that soul of the company or that shared purpose. Satya Nadella, he recognized that. Did he call it out as such? I don't know if he did or not, but he came in talking about things like growth mindset. He was the first not only to say, hey, we can't just talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion. We have to pursue it. And by the way, if we want to pursue it, we shouldn't just do it internally. We should report on our own progress externally. We should put it out there for people to say, look what they did well. Look how far they still need to go. So he is somebody who I think is very much in touch with the concept of soul and shared purpose. And look what it's done for Microsoft. The company was worth several $100 billion. Today, it's worth almost $3 trillion. So if you need a bottom line argument for something that can sound like a fuzzy comment, I think that's proof enough.
Yeah, that's pretty powerful. That is powerful. And in your own life, I mean, have you had that pivotal moment at all, Larry?
Again, it ties back to just a fervent belief of mine that each moment is made up of smaller moments. You know, there are points that looking backwards, I can reflect on and say, wow, didn't that look like a pinnacle or a peak? Yes, but because of an accumulation of these smaller moments. And actually, you know, for me and thinking about this conversation we were going to have, and for me, that's kind of my definition of a Mandela moment. You know, we talked earlier about some of the things he's known to have said. It always seems impossible until it's done. And his version of mountains beyond mountains. What I have always admired about the man and what he was able to do was his recognition that one moment led to another moment, that there was something to be learned from one moment, taking it into the next, that you never arrived at a moment where you could say all was said and done. There was another opportunity to do better or to learn more or to engage others in the learning and the leading and the doing. And so for me, it's really about the ability to continue to go from one moment to the next. I'd even say that I use his thinking of it always seems impossible until it's done as a source for how I create new ideas, how I pursue those ideas, how I figure out how to share those ideas once they're realized, and then how I use it to move me on to the next mountain beyond that mountain. So that's really what stands out for me, is learning that lesson that you've got to be able to move from one moment to the next.
Yeah. And is that your Mandela moment?
Absolutely. What I realized is that I was kind of living that Mandela moment before I even recognized it. When I enabled myself, maybe unconsciously, to see the importance of the movement from one moment to the next and to stop overemphasizing, not emphasizing, but overemphasizing the achievement in one particular moment. That was the key. And when I interviewed successful entrepreneurs, it was the same, because many of us start out saying, that's the mountain peak that I want to stake my claim to, put my flag on when I reach it. That's where I want to be. And the pattern among successful people is that once they get there, they almost look at that moment and say, is that it? Is that the limit of it? And what they realize in hindsight, I think the really successful ones, is that no, it actually was the journey. And they want to journey again from one mountain to the next. So when I finally woke up to that myself and said, I'm really enjoying the journey, and it's the challenge of one mountain beyond the next, I think that collectively was my Mandela moment.
That's wonderful. How relevant do you think his thinking and leadership is for today?
So this is really interesting, I think. Very is the answer. One of the hardest things to do today, and I don't think I have to convince anybody, is to pause and to be patient. In fact, the title of my first book was A Deliberate Pause. And the way that I came to that title is that that's exactly what I saw as a pattern across the most successful leaders, that not just here or there, not just when there was a problem, but as a matter of course, they incorporated pausing as part of how they led and how they came up with new ideas and ultimately how they succeeded. I think that defines Mandela. Now, we could argue about whether or not that would have happened in the man or was already happening in the man before he spent all that time on Robben's Island, right? But that certainly gave him time to, I think, embrace the pattern of the pause and to make it powerful. But when he left there, I felt like he incorporated it into his leadership as well. I mean, really, once there was the success of, in quotes, eliminating apartheid, there was the rebuilding. There was, okay, what are we going to become? And there was a rush in most people's minds to want to come to an answer, whether it was to punish what had been or it was to celebrate what could be, and how do we celebrate that? And I think the key to that was the ability to pause and reflect on what are we really after and how is that being shaped moment to moment. That's what I think Mandela did uniquely. He incorporated that pause, and I believe he taught us the lesson of that. And I think that's one of the key things to leadership today. It often seems like the thing that's far away and hard to do, but I think he's proof positive that that's a fiction, that it's always there and you can make it your own pattern. You just have to do it in your own way.
Yeah. And practically speaking, Larry, how do you think leaders today in this very busy, demanding world, how do you think they create time for the deliberate pause?
I think that the first thing that they do is this is something I expand on enormously in the book, A Deliberate Pause.
Yeah.
But I'll call out a couple of unique things. One is that every pause is unique. The key is to make it a pattern. So, I talk to entrepreneurs, for example, who after they would establish a venture, build a venture, and then many entrepreneurs leave that venture and leave it in the hands of people who can manage it in other phases of it better than they can. They would take a clear, calendar break, they almost a sabbatical of sorts to get their mind together for the next time. Well, that's not everybody. In fact, it's not even most people.
Yeah. Some
people that I know, and I'll highlight one in particular. Her name is Deborah Meyer. She's an education reformer. She's also a MacArthur Fellow. It's the award for they call it the Genius Award. It's an award for creativity.
Yeah.
No matter what project she's involved in, turning around a school, creating a new school, whatever it might be, she starts every day, not just herself, but in her meetings with her teams, asking 5 questions. She calls them the 5 habits of the mind. We can talk about those, at length another time. But the point is, she makes a space at the beginning of a meeting to ask these questions. Those questions are a pause. I know another entrepreneur. He was the founder of Expedia within Microsoft.
Yeah.
He also was externally the founder of Cranium, which it revived the board game market years ago. Was incredibly popular for a decade and a half. His name is Richard Tate. Richard Tate's pause is he goes out to get his lunch every day.
Okay.
Because it moves him out of his office space.
Yeah.
And when he goes, every time he goes a different direction. So even if he's going to the same deli to buy the same sandwich and following generally the same path, he will walk around a tree in the park a different direction than the one he does normally. And his belief is that even by jarring just that little bit in his pattern, he's going to come back to his workspace seeing things differently. Is it going to be a monumental idea he has on that day? No, probably not. But the pattern of breaking to have that pause in routine over time is the thing that he credits for his successful leadership. So I think that pattern of a deliberate pause is a very, very powerful thing. And those are just 3 examples. But the key to it is to realize that everyone either has that pause already and is not leveraging it, or has the opportunity to incorporate it in a way that doesn't upend how they do everything else in their lives right now.
Yeah, that's great. Just a couple of fun facts. What is your favorite food?
Fruit or food?
Food.
Pretty much anything my wife cooks. We divide and conquer in our household. I'm cleanup and she's cooking.
Yeah.
And I used to joke for the first 7 years of our marriage that I never ate the same meal twice. Part of the reason is that even if she's cooking a similar dish, she never does it in the same way. She picks a new spice from the cabinet. She takes a new leftover out of the fridge. So
Yeah.
I'm always getting to eat creativity every night for dinner. That's really my favorite food.
And what is your favorite outlet for creativity?
My favorite outlet for creativity really is the place I find the greatest inspiration for a new idea, and that is getting outside and getting in nature. You know, there's a lot of research and evidence that says it's good for all of us. For me, it's vital. It's part of my mental health as well as a endearing and enduring source of my creativity. But I'll go back to what I said about the deliberate pause. It's not just one particular walk or hike or kayak trip or diving trip or whatever it might be that makes me come back with a head full of ideas. Sometimes that happens.
Yeah.
It's the pattern of engaging myself in that space that is the difference maker for my creativity.
Yeah, that's great. And the other question I have is, what would you say to your 14-year-old self?
Be patient. Respect the rules, but be willing to trust your gut when the rules don't make sense. And I guess that incorporates that other piece of advice of trusting your gut. But my final clincher that wraps it all together is find something fun in everything you're doing. That's what I would tell my 14-year-old self. My 14-year-old self didn't understand those things. I might have heard those things, but I didn't understand it. I would love to believe that if I could tell my 14-year-old self this is going to matter in the future, that I would have believed it sooner because it's made all the difference.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Just in a few sort of final closing moments, Larry, any final thoughts you have about leading boldly into the future? I know in your book you've also spoken about the future is here.
Mm.
Could you share just your thoughts around the future of leadership and how the future is here? What is it that we need to understand about leading boldly into the future?
Sure. So I'll take that second part first about the elements of the future that are incorporated into rebel leadership. So rebel leadership is broken down into these 5 patterns that you see across the most successful leaders, no matter their sector, no matter what part of the world, over the last 20 years during this very volatile time. The 5th of those is the chapter that's titled "The Long View Matters Most Right Now." And so it's this idea that we often have a long-term view, but it's something we come to at an annual planning session or an annual board meeting, or I'll just say infrequently, rather than finding ways to incorporate it into this moment in time. And I think that if you look at the organizations that are the most successful, they're the ones that are saying, yeah, that's the place we want to end up. But what is its relevance to this moment? How should we alter or edit this moment in order to increase our chances of accumulating those small steps to actually get to that place we want to go? That's what I mean when I talk about the long term. As it relates to leadership today and how we get there in general, how leaders of any stripe in any organization get there in general, I think it's to remember some of those core things that we've talked about. I'll give you 3.
Yeah.
Number 1, leadership is collective and cultural when it's at its best. That's when it becomes a competitive advantage, when it's cultural and it's collective, not just in word, but in deed. Number 2, leadership is also at its most effective when it's driven by an individual appreciation and better an understanding of soul, and how that blends with an organization's priority, or what should be their priority, on shared purpose. Shared purpose, not just stated, but shared purpose collectively defined and defined ongoing. That's the second thing. So there's collective and cultural, and there's driven by soul and shared purpose. And the third thing is really the context in which those things occur and the context that argues for them. And that is, we live in a new abnormal. There's this greater volatility and uncertainty and complexity and ambiguity that we feel in the world is here to stay. And
Yeah.
it will keep changing its form. And the sooner we embrace that and then adapt our leadership to that prevailing situation,
Yeah.
the faster our effectiveness as leaders is going to rise.
Larry, thank you so much for sharing that. Thank you for being the rebel leader that you are. And I look forward to sharing more of these rebel moments with you. Thank you so much. Friends, what bold steps have you taken recently? And where in this new abnormal world are you being called out to be bolder than before? Larry Robertson, an inspiring friend, Fulbright scholar, and award-winning author of Rebel Leadership, helps us understand boldness, the very essence of our Mandela-inspired podcast, Leading Boldly into the Future. Bob Marley was a bold, soulful musician who pioneered reggae music. Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a bold Supreme Court justice who challenged her profession and morally guided the court. Nelson Mandela was a bold freedom fighter and president who challenged autocracy and the right to be free. All of these rebel leaders who climbed mountains beyond mountains to lead boldly into the future. Historically, Greek philosophers have admired boldness as a philosophical virtue. Thrasos symbolized boldness in Greek mythology. But today, however, boldness is no longer simply a virtue to be respected. It is an essential ingredient in life, entrepreneurship, and leadership to create the future that you dream of. What is boldness? Boldness is defined as the willingness to take risks, to act with courage and overcome fear. Boldness fuels you to challenge the status quo, to stand up for what you believe in, even when unpopular, to break barriers, to pursue innovation, explore new ideas, and so much more. Larry, in his award-winning work, Rebel Leadership, helps us understand that boldness is no longer a desirable quality, but a core competence in any environment that is calling us loudly or quietly for innovation, adaptation, and change. That humanity, people like yourself, want to be bold, but often fear being too bold or not bold enough. And that boldness is not a finite quality or quantity. There is a range of boldness, which you can increase, decrease, build up, or quieten down. Expanding your boldness depends on two critical factors. The first is you and what you know about yourself. Who are you? What actions do you take in tough, challenging environments? And how do your actions impact on and engage with others? For example, if you witness wrongdoing or social injustice, do you stand up and speak out and embolden others to do the same, or do you stand by quietly? The second factor that increases your boldness is what others know and think about you. How do others perceive you, trust you, or are they willing to engage? The more people believe in you and affirm you, the bolder you will be. Like the boss who confidently says, "You've got this. I know you can do it, and I know you can do it well." Expanding your boldness or increasing your boldness takes on a living energy of itself. You become bolder more frequently. You embolden others to be bolder more frequently too. And you create a culture of collective boldness, a movement that inspires leaders and followers to lead. As Nelson Mandela once said, after climbing a great hill, only to find many more hills to climb. Boldness is a fuel that energizes, galvanizes, and mobilizes you and the collective to climb a great hill and climb mountains beyond mountains to tackle the toughest challenges of our time. So until next time, remember that leading boldly is about making thoughtful, clear choices. And bold leadership is about taking bold action, climbing a great hill, or climbing mountains beyond mountains, one bold step at a time. One bold step for you, but together, a giant step for humanity. So take care and take thoughtful, bold action.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Leading Boldly into the Future. Please find links and connections mentioned in this show in our blog and never miss an episode by subscribing at anne-pratt.com. That's ANNE-PRATT.com. May these insights from inspiring industry leaders, remarkable disruptors, and courageous champions of change bring forth a brand new you, emboldened, empowered, and ready to inspire hope. Come back soon, share with your friends, sign up on anne-pratt.com and join our movement for change. Why? Because the world needs you to lead boldly too.